Expulsion of Vitebsk Jews averted. Now, in the year 1605, the king had issued a decree that the Jews were to be expelled from Vitebsk during the course of 2 years and no other Jews admitted. He made but one exception, and that was that only Jews who could prove that their presence was indispensable to the welfare of the community could remain. About a year after this decree, Mordechai Aaron Segal, who had become friendly with the mayor of Vitebsk because he used to sell him whiskey, came to Vitebsk and settled there. Mordechai Aaron Segal was a respected person and, in fact, quite charitable, but perhaps he was inclined to give his money where it would bring him the most honor. When Mordechai came to Vitebsk and saw how Tevel gave charity without making any fuss and without looking for any special recognition or honor, he saw how more preferable was his friend's modest demeanor and made up his mind to act likewise in the future. Tevel had brought a few more Jewish families with him when he came to Vitebsk, saying he required their services for his land cultivation. As Tevel was a friend of Mordechai's, and the latter a friend of the mayor's, the matter was arranged without difficulty. But 2 years after Tevel's arrival in the town, Mordechai told him that he had learned from the mayor that the king was not satisfied with the way that his decree was being treated so lightly. According to him, there were far too many Jews in Vitebsk, and they would have to renew their claims proving they were essential and useful citizens. Furthermore, if and when they were granted permission to remain, they would have to pay a very high sum for the privilege. Mordechai Aaron Segal called a meeting of the leaders of the community and told them they must be prepared for unpleasant news. There would soon be a decree issued ordering the Jews of Vitebsk to leave the town. The members of the meeting were naturally very disturbed at the news and decided to call the Jews to a day of fasting and special prayers. Tevel was very grieved at the tragic turn of events, for though he personally might be granted permission to remain, his heart was sore for his fellow Jews, who, were they to be driven out unceremoniously, would lose their present means of livelihood and face ruin and starvation. He spent much time contemplating any possibility of a way out of the trouble, and suddenly it occurred to him that perhaps a bribe would buy the mayor, in whose hands lay the power to grant permission to individual Jews to remain in Vitebsk. All the mayor had to do was say that the man was indispensable. Tevel lost no time in calling on his partner and friend Mordechai Aaron Segal to say, "See, my friend, we must help our brothers in their hour of need. We might so easily have been in a similar dilemma, and so, to show our gratitude to the Almighty, we must make a sacrifice. I, for my part, am prepared to give a sum, however large you think necessary, and you know the mayor well enough to decide what he would regard as a handsome gift, so that he promises to allow the Jews to stay." Mordechai Aaron Segal was deeply impressed with the generosity of his friend and the sincerity of his desire to help the Jews of Vitebsk. He hurried with Tevel's offer to the mayor, who graciously consented to accept the present and promised he would see that the Jews were allowed to remain in the town. He pointed out, however, that he would still have to publish the king's decree first, and then afterwards use his authority to grant the Jews special permission to remain. Mordechai Aaron Segal agreed with the plan and sent word around to all the Jews to prepare them for the decree and to tell them they must not be alarmed, as the mayor had promised the publication was just a matter of formality. Sure enough, after a few days, the dreaded decree appeared on the public notice boards, throwing the Jews of Vitebsk into absolute panic. It was useless trying to convince them that they must not take these notices seriously. 4 days after the publication of the king's decree, the mayor let it be known that as the Jews were essential to the existence and progress of the state, he was using the authority granted him by the king and would allow the Jews to remain in Vitebsk without hindrance or interference. The relief and joy among the Jews was indescribable, and when the news got around that it was Tevel's efforts backed by his money that had secured for them their present salvation, their gratitude to him was unbounded. The year 1605 came, and Tevel's wife gave birth to a son. They were so very grateful for this precious gift for which they had hoped and prayed that it was not surprising to learn that they gave him everything of the best. Tevel was not selfish in his gratitude, for he sent bigger donations even than before to all the yeshivas in Poland and Lithuania. Tevel named his son Nachum after his own father, and the boy was a fine lad and very gifted. He absorbed his studies eagerly and showed excellent results to the delight of his teachers and parents, who were so anxious to see him grow into a fine character, Torah-loving Jew. Mordechai Aaron Segal also had a son whose name was Yehuda Leib. He was a good lad and anxious to make progress in his studies, but he just wasn't cut out to be a student. And so, when he grew up, his father took him into business where he did so well that Mordechai Aaron Segal gradually let his son take over the reins of management and himself devoted all his time to social welfare. Yehuda Leib developed his father's business so successfully that their whiskey was known and appreciated far and wide. In the year 1620, the mayor of Vitebsk died, and in his place was appointed one who became an absolute thorn in the flesh to the Jews. He hated them, and nothing they did was right in his prejudiced eyes. He found fault with them at every turn, and took every opportunity of sending in complaints against them to the government. Of course, he would have no association with Mordechai Aaron Segal or his son Yehuda Leib, and refused even to touch their whiskey. This new mayor was so filled with Jew hatred that he could not bring himself to accept anything from them, and would not take Tevel's gifts. This period of persecution had been going on for about 2 years. During this time, Yehuda Leib had managed, despite these adverse circumstances, to promote his business to such an extent that he was even receiving orders for his now famous whiskey from the very highest officials in the government, some of whom he had become quite friendly with in consequence. By 1624, Yehuda Leib's whiskey had reached the royal court and was so liked by the king that he eventually invited him to his august presence, praised him for his excellent beverage, and conferred upon him medals of merit in the presence of his courtiers and counselors. So it was that Yehuda Leib became an influential personage and came to play an important role in Polish government circles. During one of Yehuda Leib's visits to the capital city, he learned on high authority that the government treasury was empty, and that the king had commanded all his governors in the various states to obtain loans on the best terms obtainable. He also heard that the governors, in the main, had met with little success. As soon as Yehuda Leib returned to Vitebsk, he immediately called on Tevel and told him of what he had learned. Tevel at once declared that he was ready to loan a big sum of money to the government on long term, the loan to be repaid to him out of government revenue, but he would only advance the loan on the following conditions. A. The Jews of Vitebsk and district were to have their rights of equality restored to them. B. They were to have the right of buying immovable property and to build houses in Vitebsk itself, not as up to now only in its suburbs. C. The government was to grant the Jews of Vitebsk the right to establish a Jewish community with the same freedom as enjoyed by the Catholic community. Tevel's friend Mordechai Aaron Segal thought it was a very wise suggestion and said he believed it had a good chance of succeeding. He offered to go with his son to the capital to meet the respective members of the government and put before them Tevel's offer on the loan and his conditions. Mordechai Aaron Segal and Yehuda Leib put the plan into effect and waited hopefully for the result. Some days passed, and then Mordechai Aaron Segal and his son received the royal command to appear before the king. The king informed them that he was willing to accept the loan from Tevel on the latter's conditions. The king forthwith dispatched Yehuda Leib as a special messenger to instruct the mayor of Vitebsk regarding the details of the matter and to collect the money and bring it back to the king. This was in the year 1627. The mayor was not too pleased at the turn of events, but he had no alternative other than to obey the king's command. He therefore called a special meeting of the city council, the representatives of the government, as well as the priests of the Catholic Church, and with the best face he could bring himself to put upon the matter, he made a public proclamation quoting the king's decree. The Jews were henceforth to be allowed to establish their own community in Vitebsk, and the local government authorities were to do all possible to facilitate their carrying this into effect. Further, all Jews were to be allowed to live in Vitebsk with the same rights as other citizens.